So Sai, I think many of you would know her, but I'm going to sort of at least highlight some aspects of her career and trajectory. She's an associate professor of city and regional planning and a joint appointment there at Berkeley between the Department of City and Regional Planning and the Global Metropolitan Studies area. Her research and teaching, broadly pivots around global urban inequalities with a particular focus on urbanization and planning institutes in the global south and on the spatial politics of land use and property. At Berkeley, she is the chair of the Urban Studies major and co-director of an interdisciplinary cluster. She has worked as an urban planner in the United States, India, the United Arab Emirates, and as a consultant to the UN Habitat in Nairobi. She has published in various urban studies and planning journals, and her research has been quoted extensively, including The Guardian. Her first book, and this talk is work that she's doing towards a second book, but her first book, which was called Shareholder Cities, Land Transformation Along Urban Corridors in India, with the University of Pennsylvania Press, 2019, explored new spatial forms of urbanization by focusing on land confiscation along infrastructural economic corridors in liberalizing India. It was, I think, among the early work in the post-liberalized economy of India that looked at this phenomena of land conversion along corridors like the Mumbai-Pune corridor, which are really moving towards becoming metropolitan areas of a particular kind. And so it was really very important early work. In the Shareholder City, that is in this work, Sai argues that some of India's most decisive conflicts over its urban future will unfold in the regions along the new economic corridors, where electorally strong agrarian, property classes directly encounter financial, powerful incoming urban firms. And, it's interesting that a number of industries and industrial homes in India have in that period also moved into real estate. And some of this is propelled by that, in a sense, a largely organized real estate sector. And so I think her work really surfaced some of these forces that will inform and mold the way property is even bought and anticipated for the future. And it's it's astounding how much of that property has bought. They usually get firms from Europe or the United States to do a master plan, which becomes the instrument for them to convert agricultural land to urban land. And then they just sit on it, waiting for the metropolitan development to catch up. And this pattern, I think, implicitly was surfaced in just the studies that you did. And I think early catching on of that pattern. And I think she focused on the first economic corridor, which is the Mumbai-Pune Expressway, which was an important piece of infrastructure that connected a completely different relationship between these big cities, and the construction of 3 new cities along it. The book derived its title from a current mode of resolving agrarian-urban conflicts in which agrarian landowners into shareholders as a way to buy them stake into the projects, right? And it's a form of partnership in these sort of corridor cities. And the distributional implication of these new land transformations is what he really studied. Shifting the focus of her study of India's contemporary urbanization away from megacities to these in-between corridor regions, she explored the production of uneven urban development that unsettles older histories of agrarian capitalism, the emergence of agrarian class as protagonists in the making of real estate and emergent real estate markets in India. And so I think this was really very important work. In the new work in our talk today, she draws from the ongoing book manuscript, which looks at planning of vertical cities in Mumbai. And the book looks at mundane land use planning instruments, which is FSI, what we call FAR here, TDR, which is transfer of development rights, and critically unpacks the technopolitics of these instruments, that is the political projects that are enacted through them. And they're really instrumentalized quite powerfully in the city of Mumbai in that nexus between the real estate lobby and politicians. And I think there are many cases that surface every day and they surprise us sometimes. What I want to just sort of highlight in closing is that Sai, she has a PhD in urban planning from Harvard, 2013, urban planning, a master's from MIT, urban design degree from the University of Michigan, and a bachelor's in architecture from the Indian MIT, which is the Manipal Institute of Technology. And I only highlight this because I think for me, what is really interesting about her work is trained as an architect, urban designer, urban planner, and a PhD. She can make very interesting links between the implications of these emergent patterns, policies, but also their spatial implications, which often we find very hard to bridge. And so for me personally, as an architect and urban designer, I can that work really resonates, but I think it's a very important bridge that would be critical both for pedagogy, but also for us to look at our cities more instrumentally with some agency. So thank you for everything you're doing, Sai, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Rahul, for that more than generous introduction. And it's really so wonderful. It's like a homecoming being back in Cambridge, seeing former teachers, former students, very, very dear friends. So really, thank you so much. And this, as Rahul said, is ongoing research, which is part of a book manuscript. And this is the first time I'm presenting it in public. So all the more special to do it here on former home turf. And I should acknowledge the research assistance of Ria Shah, who was a former GST student and who's now, and the brilliant photographer Aslam Syed, who took the photographs for me. So I'm going to delve into the research, the argument. I'll speak for around 40 minutes, if that's okay. I'm really looking forward to your comments, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
What we're here for. All right.
This, right? Oh, thanks.
You want the lights?
So, can you all see? Yeah.
If you can dim them, is that possible? Yeah, that's good. That's good.
So in 2002, the Adani Group won a bid for the Dharavi redevelopment master plan. Adani is arguably one of India's most powerful capitalists, a small-time diamond trader from the state of Gujarat. Adani's meteoric rise in economic power mirrors that of the political rise of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The Adani conglomerate controls most rent-thick sectors in India, from coal to real estate. And Dharavi is the new frontier in Adani's rentier acquisitions. Now, I say the new frontier because the prized asset in the Dharavi redevelopment is not the land. It's not only the terra firma land, but the air above the land. In exchange for redeveloping the Dharavi slum, the Mumbai municipality will give the Adani Group almost 40 million square feet. So to put this in perspective, the mega project of Rockefeller Center, around 10 million square feet of air rights or density or development rights, right? One of the most ambitious rezoning projects in New York, Hudson Yards, that Rachel Weber writes about, around 24 million square feet of air rights, right? Dharavi sits at around 40 million, projected to sit at around 40 million square feet of air rights, almost 4 times that of Rockefeller Center and almost twice that. The Dharavi redevelopment by one of India's most powerful conglomerates, which is backed by a centralizing state, is part of a larger and older planning project to make Mumbai, quote unquote, slum-free. Mumbai has the unfortunate moniker of being called Slumbai, right? Not very creative, Mumbai, Slumbai. And this is a picture of a slum in Kurla, in the Kurla neighborhood, which I'll come to, during Iftar, the Ramzan feast, right? And this is a picture taken for my research by Aslam. Over the past 2 decades, slums like this, right? Slums like the Kurla slums are being redeveloped into new vertical cities. Quote unquote slum dwellers are being relocated into these massive redevelopment complexes. Mumbai has a dense clustering of tightly packed, sunlight deprived housing complexes that have been referred to as vertical slums. these vertical slums are the crux of my research, right? These vertical slums don't just rise up into the air. These vertical slums are financed by monetizing air, right? So Adani, for instance, gets almost 40 million square feet of air rights for rehabilitating Dharavi's slum dwellers into these vertical slums. So what we have here is a mega planning project to enclose air, right? The enclosure of land, of course, has a very long history that goes back to the enclosure movement, 16th century Western Europe. In the Dharavi case, the enclosure of land is extruded up to the new frontier of air. Now, the Dharavi redevelopment signifies a new social contract between the slum and the capitalist city. So there is, of course, a very long and contested scholarship on the relationship of slums and the capitalist city. Think, for instance, about Haussmann's capitalist transformation of Paris in the mid to late 19th century. And when Haussmann built the grand boulevards and the wide sidewalks, this capitalist transformation of Paris necessitated large-scale slum clearance, right? So Haussmannization, even today, remains a shorthand for slum clearance. In a striking departure, the Mumbai experience of monetizing air does not disregard slum dwellers. On the contrary, developers, including Adani, can unlock monetized air only after they have fulfilled the condition of building free housing for slum dwellers, right? So Mumbai's master plan or the development plan regulates that for every 10 square feet of free housing provided for slum dwellers, developers will get incentive air rights of 13.3 square feet. So just do some basic math here. So according to the Dharavi survey, there are around 85,000 families that currently occupy the land. Each of the resettled families will get a quote unquote free house of 350 square feet. So what does Adani gain? He gains 40 million square feet of air rights, right? In other words, Adani can unlock the value of air as a monetizable asset only if Adani rehabilitates slum dwellers. So what we have here is that the square footage of air rights is pegged to the magnitude of free housing. Developers then have the incentive to rehabilitate more and more slum dwellers as this translates into more incentive air rights. This is a very different relationship from slum clearance, right? The relationship between slums and the capitalist city here is not opposition, right? Slums are not getting cleared to make way for the capitalist city, but there's a new relationship of value here between monetized air and free housing, right? And that's the new social contract that I want to interrogate. So this is the roadmap for the next 35 or so minutes, right? So I'll first start with this concept of air rights. So what do we mean by air rights? Right? Air, after all, is the quintessential public good. So what does it mean to enclose and privatize air? I'll then move on to the planning of Mumbai's air rights market, and I'll make this argument in 3 maps or 3 visuals. And then I'll end with the costs and contradictions of free housing, right? Is there anything called free housing, right? So don't hold your breath, no. There are costs and capitalist contradictions of free housing, and that's what I'll end with. Right? So let's start with the concept of air rights. Now, in cities as diverse as New York, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, the new real estate game in town is not terra firma land. It's the air rights pertinent to the plot of land. Air rights are a form of property that is distinct from terra firma land. The making of air rights as a distinct form of property entails 2 legal maneuvers. It entails the legal fiction of severing and the legal fiction of stacking. Right? The first legal fiction of severing is enabled through the technical instrument of the FAR, floor area ratio in the United States, FSI, or floor space index in former British colonies, including India. Right? So what is the FSI or FAR? Very simply, it's the right to build. It's prescribed by the city's zoning code, and it regulates the air rights or the density or the development rights or the buildable area on a plot of land. So say, for instance, a landowner has a plot of land that's 60 by 40 square feet with an FSI of 2. The landowner is entitled as of right. This is important, right? As of right, the landowner is entitled to 4,800 square feet, right? 60 into 40 into 2. Now, market advocates like Alain Berthaud and his protege, Bimal Patel, argue that Indian cities should increase their FSI. They argue that Indian cities have a very low FSI. Most large cities, including Midtown Manhattan, have an FSI of 10 or 15. And this scarcity in Indian cities can be corrected by the market by increasing FSI, right? Neoclassical economics, demand and supply. Now, this kind of technical argument cleverly obfuscates and depoliticizes the politics of FSI. The FSI is not merely a technical instrument. It's a technical instrument that enacts normative and political projects. At the crux of the FSI is the question of ownership, right? Who owns air rights? And normatively, who should own air rights? Now, here it's very helpful to bring in the comparison of Sao Paulo. Right? Sao Paulo, like Mumbai, has a very low FSI. The 2002 Sao Paulo Master Plan downzoned Sao Paulo's FSI from 2 to 1. In the United States, this would constitute a regulatory taking. In Sao Paulo, the 2002 Master Plan draws from the federal urban law, the City Statute of 2001, and the City Statute draws from the 1988 Brazilian Constitution. And the 1988 Brazilian Constitution introduced the idea of the social function of property. Right? The social function of property first severs the right to own land from the right to build. And then the social function of property guarantees that the right to build will always be subordinate to the social function or the public interest, right? So in other words, there's a fundamental reframing here in Sao Paulo's master plan, right? Air rights, which in the United States is vested in the title of the private landowner, Sao Paulo reframes the air rights not as a right vested in the title, but as a government allocation, right? So Sao Paulo decisively decides through the 1988 Constitution that the local state, the subnational state, owns air rights, right? In the United States, like I said, it's vested in the private title. Unlike Sao Paulo, unlike the United States, Mumbai and other Indian cities do not have any constitutional commitments or legal statutes that normatively decide this question of who owns air rights. So in Mumbai, this political question of who owns air rights is quite literally left up in the air, right? So the first fiction then is about severing, right? But the FSI is enacting a normative political question of who owns air rights. Right? Now, the second legal fiction is the TDR. It's enacted by the TDR, right? Now, the trading of air rights got institutionalized in the 1960s and 70s in New York when the Historic Landmarks Act prevented private landowners of historic buildings from realizing the full economic potential of their plot of land. So the TDR market or the TDR instrument enables unused development rights to be transferred across space and stacked onto another plot of land, right? So if land is spatially fixed, air rights as a form of property enabled by the TDR instrument can be traded across space, right? So that's why scholars who are writing in the 1970s, including John Costonis, called TDR space adrift, right? Some people refer to the TDR market as making land fly, right? So I want you to keep this conceptual architecture of air rights, right? This fiction of severing and this fiction of stacking at the back of your mind, because I'll keep coming back to it. So moving on now to part two, how does Mumbai's air rights market work, right? How did planners create this new form of property and with what spatial consequences, right? So visual number one, and I want to start with this map. Now in Mumbai, there are many types of TDR. There's road TDR, heritage TDR, slum TDR. The real estate game in town is the slum TDR, right? That's why Adani is in the slum TDR market. Now you can see my cursor here. So this is Dharavi. And Dharavi is the most recognizable slum in Mumbai, the durable slum, right? As Liza Weinstein calls it. Now to the north of Dharavi is this vast swath of quote unquote slum that stretches from Kurla to Ghatkopar to Chandivali to Powai. Now, this is Mumbai's international airport, also in the Kurla neighborhood. And very important, the Mumbai International Airport is going through a modernization plan. It's a public-private partnership, and the promoter is Adani. Right? Now, along the boundary walls of the international airport is this sprawling Kurla slum, right? So if anyone who has flown into the Mumbai International Airport has seen this vast swath of cerulean blue tarpaulin sheets over the corrugated roofs of the Kurla slum. Now, I just realized that for some reason there's a scattering of quote unquote slums here, which is not showing up on this map. But it's also here along the airport that the journalist Catherine Boo wrote her book, Behind the Beautiful Forevers. Right? Now, there are three things that I'd like for you to note about this map. The first is this entire swath of the Kurla to Powai slums stretches along LBS mark, the Lal Bahadur Shastri mark. During the Cold War and the Third World Political Project, 1950s to 1970s, LBS mark was the industrial spine of Bombay. The working class along LBS mark was strongly organized, and iconic trade union leaders like Datta Samant are organized from these neighborhoods. Right? Second, most of these slums in Kurla to Powai proliferated and got consolidated in the late 1960s and early 1970s, right? And this time period matters. These are not old slums. They got consolidated during the Third World Political Project. And I'm going to come to this. And lastly, so this is a zoom in of this rectangle here. So you see that Mumbai's slums are largely on the eastern side of the city, right? So Mumbai is a spatially divided city, and most of the slums are on the eastern side of the city. Now, I want to show you a few photographs of the Kurla quote-unquote slums, right? And this is based on research that I've been doing in the neighborhood over the past 2 years. Right? Now, this is an image of an industrial estate, Abdul Rashid compound. In the midst of these so-called slums is a dense clustering of industrial estates. In the 1960s and 70s, at the peak decades of the Third World Political Project, development economists, right, and remember development economics inaugurated as a discipline for post-colonial democracies, right, in the late 1940s. Development economists of India, and many of them were working out of the Mumbai region, they had a state policy of industrial estates, where the state would acquire and assemble land and then allot the land at subsidized rates or nominal rates to small-scale workshops. In the context of the Third World Political Project, import substitution, industrialization, and the 5-year plans, these industrial estates were part of a wider social policy of full employment for Mumbai's residents and India's citizens. Right? And they were part of a political economic project of ancillarization. So what do I mean by ancillarization? So there were a large number of big factories along LBS Marg, right? These big factories would subcontract certain manufacturing tasks to small-scale workshops located in the industrial estate. The industrial estate, the small-scale workshops, would in turn subcontract manufacturing tasks to home-based workers in slums, right? So all of the quote-unquote the informal economy was part of a planned political economic project of ancillarization. Right? This is an image, and the engineering products which were manufactured in the industrial estates and the had a very high degree of technical expertise, right? This was not quote unquote unskilled work. So this is an image of Ashok Ali, who migrated to Bombay in the 1960s from eastern Uttar Pradesh. He had worked for over 30 years in small scale workshops. And you see here that he's standing near a lathe. He's a very experienced lathe operator. And in this small scale workshop in a Kurla slum, he manufactures valves that are sold to the municipal gas utility, right? So that's the degree of sophistication of the technical engineering work. Now, it's very clear from my research that the informal engineering workshops in what is glossed over as slums were actually manufacturing components for big factories like Tata Steel, Godrej, and in this case, the municipal gas utility. Now, why is this important? This is important because Bombay's low FSI of 1.33 was enacted during this period. Bombay's town planners during this period were inspired by the UK Labour Party and Fabian socialism. The UK under Clement Attlee had nationalized development rights. India did not nationalize development rights, but the low FSI was a strategy to socialize land, to spur industrial accumulation out of the city to backward regions, and to realize the social policy of full employment for citizens. In other words, the low FSI was not a technical instrument. It enabled slums, quote unquote slums, to get consolidated as part of a third world political economic project of ancillarization. And it's precisely these former industrial neighborhoods or slums that got consolidated in the 1960s and 70s. It's precisely this geography of slums that's now ground zero for TDR and the free housing policy. Right? Visual number 2. Fast forward to 1995, the political party, the Shiv Sena, introduced free housing, and that for every 10 square feet of free housing built, developers will get incentive air rights of 13.3 square feet. Now, the TDR policy seems to be a win-win situation. Right? For local governments can deploy their regulatory power of zoning to quite literally mint revenues out of thin air. Local governments don't have to rely on redistributive taxes, which are electorally fraught. They don't have to turn to debt. So in an era of fiscal austerity, local governments can finance their social obligations through monetizing air. Right? For developers in a context where land prices rival that of Midtown Manhattan, the TDR policy allows them to cash in on the sky. And slum dwellers get free housing at no cost. Right? Now, though the TDR policy is framed as providing free housing using free air, the TDR market did not take off, right? It was framed for local governments, developers, slum dwellers, win-win. The empirical puzzle is it did not take off. So take a look at this. This data actually was not available, and I'm very grateful to planners who are working in the municipal office of Bombay, who literally looked at old Godrej almiras, and they got this data, right? And this is based on that. Now you see here from 1995 to 2002, the TDR market languished and limped along. Very few developers were interested in the slum TDR market. And during this time, the city got a smattering of small-scale slum rehabilitation complexes. From 2003 to 2011, the TDR market booms. And again, I don't know what is happening to my maps, but this gets cut off. You'll see another major spike here with the Dharavi redevelopment, right? And for some reason, it got cut off. But you see a major boom from 2003 to 2011. During this time, almost 60 million square feet of TDR was issued by the local government as incentives for developers to rehabilitate slum dwellers. These peak years of the TDR generation coincided with the World Bank funded Mumbai Urban Transport Project, MUTP. So this then raises the question, right? Why did Shiv Sena's free housing scheme get a lukewarm response from developers? Relatedly, why and how did the entry of a powerful financial institution, the World Bank, stabilize the real estate, the air rights market? Or to pose this question differently, how did the entry of the World Bank de-risk the TDR market? Right? Now, before the World Bank MUTP contract, developers were risk averse to slum rehabilitation projects. The Shiv Sena's free housing policy required developers to secure the consent of 70% of the slum. It was only when the slum dwellers gave their consent that the project would then get approved and the TDR would get granted. Now, because of that prior history of ancillarization that I laid out, and it's also very important to note that the Shiv Sena emerged as a political party precisely during that time of ancillarization, right, in the late 1960s. It's because of this prior history that slum dwellers are a politically organized constituency. And securing consent is a long drawn and very unpredictable process. So even the zoning incentive of TDR was not enough to allay their risks and attract developers. The World Bank inaugurated a new mode of urbanization, which I call the infrastructure resettlement nexus, right? And it's because of the infrastructure resettlement nexus that the TDR market got stabilized. Now, a very, very brief tangent as context on the World Bank, which is always a looming planning actor in the global south. In the early 1980s, the massive big dam infrastructure projects funded by the bank came under intense scrutiny. Social movements across the global south, including the Sobradino Dam movement in Brazil and the Narmada movement in India, demanded accountability from the bank for its large-scale infrastructure-induced displacement. To regain its legitimacy, the World Bank came up with a social policy on involuntary resettlement. Under this new policy, the World Bank would lend for infrastructure and resettlement plans. In other words, the World Bank yoked together infrastructure and resettlement into the same debt contract. At the behest of the World Bank, Mumbai's planning institutions in the early 2000s were restructured. Those of you who are familiar with Mumbai, and it was at the behest of the bank that the same planning agency both implemented infrastructure and the resettlement project. In other words, the World Bank sidestepped the 70% democratic consent clause of the Shiv Sena's free housing policy. Even though the World Bank's social policy of universal resettlement sounds very progressive, it was premised on involuntary displacement. Slum dwellers can negotiate the terms of resettlement, but they cannot negotiate the infrastructure project, right? They cannot politically contest the specific infrastructure project that is being financed. They cannot politically contest what types of public works they need for their city. So in other words, these questions, infrastructure was left out of the planning debate and it was depoliticized. Now, I just like for us very briefly to think about security, right? Because this is about land and the air rights are pertinent to land. And I want for us to think about security in these various regimes. Before the World Bank's MUTP project, developers had to secure the consent of slum dwellers. And I don't want to be too rosy about this, right? Anyone who's worked in Mumbai knows that there was violence in the securing consent process. But nonetheless, and this is really important, there was a legal democratic provision of securing consent. Right? The World Bank sidestepped this democratic mandate with an involuntary resettlement policy. By doing so, the World Bank secured developer expectations. Developers now know that resettlement has to be completed because the resettlement plan is also part of the World Bank's debt contract. So resettlement is also subject to the punitive disciplinary logics of debt. And as the World Bank secured developer expectations, it simultaneously undermined the security of tenure of slum dwellers. Yes, slum dwellers get free housing, but not free housing on their own terms, and the free housing is premised on involuntary displacement. Now, even though the World Bank contract ended in 2011, this nexus of infrastructure and resettlement is now coded into Mumbai's planning institutions. It's not an accident that the Adani conglomerate, which controls mega infrastructure projects, including the Mumbai International Airport to the north, had now entered slum redevelopment, lured by the new frontier of air monetization. So mega infrastructure projects are now the de facto master plan of Mumbai, right? And I can just reel these off. And those of you from Mumbai will know this. Marine Drive, Worli Coastal Road, Atal Setu Sea Link, Worli Suri Connector, Versova Dahisar Coastal Road, Versova Virar Sea Link, Orange Gate Marine Drive Tunnel, massive metro expansion, Mumbai International Airport, Navi Mumbai International Airport. So mega infrastructure is the de facto master plan of Mumbai. And these infrastructures of sea links, coastal roads, tunnels, elevated roads, metros, airports, ports are causing displacement on an unprecedented scale. And the democratic mandate of resettling these displaced citizens creates a new market in air rights, right? So in other words, the planning of the air rights market exposes a new political economy of rent in the city. Right? Which brings me to my third visual, my third map, which is on the geography of the TDR market, right? Now you can see here the World Bank funded infrastructure projects, right? It's these two east-west link roads, right? Now I should note that these east-west link roads were actually proposed as early as 1962 by the traffic engineering consultant, right? So these east-west roads have been a planning idea for a very, very long time. It took the World Bank's infrastructure resettlement contract to implement it and to blast through some of the most organized slums in the city, right? So all of the slum dwellers along these east-west link roads are displaced, right? Developers are then building these massive slum resettlement complexes on the eastern side of the city. It's these eastern neighborhoods that were formerly the thriving industrial working class neighborhoods, right? So the incentive FSI is generated on the eastern side of Mumbai. Developers are then transferring the incentive FSI across space to the Western neighborhoods, which have very high land prices, right? The Western neighborhoods are where Bollywood stars live. It's where some of the wealthiest industrial capitalists of India live. In other words, location matters for the TDR market, right? The legal fiction of TDR is that location is irrelevant. Space is irrelevant. The TDR market assumes that air rights are commensurable across space. It doesn't matter if an extra floor of a building is severed and transferred and stacked onto another plot of land. But the TDR market only works because location matters. developers are attracted to the TDR market because of the spatial logic of price arbitrage, right? Land prices are low in the eastern working class slum neighborhoods. Land prices are exorbitantly high in the western neighborhoods. This east-west spatial divide is a legacy of Bombay's prior industrial geography, and the TDR market preys upon this spatially divided geography, right? It's this spatially divided geography that opens up the possibility of price arbitrage, right? Which brings me to the key contradiction of the TDR market. The making of the TDR market has perversely transformed the nature of the local state, right? The local state can now provide free housing not by socializing access to land, not by equalizing the land markets, but only by keeping land prices as high as possible in certain neighborhoods vis-a-vis others, right? This is a very, very different role of the state. You look at Marxist planning scholarship from the 19th, Richard Fogelsong's Property Contradiction, for instance, or Lisa Petty's Slum as a housing question. They argue that the capitalist city needs the local state to step in and socialize access to land for the working class. That's what the town planners of the 1960s and 1970s were doing, right? When they were planning ancillarization, the planning strategy was socialized access to land, right? And the low FSI enabled that. Now, the making of the TDR market is also a remaking of the local state, where the local state deploys its zoning powers to keep land prices as high as possible to fulfill its social obligation of quote unquote free housing. So to end, what are the costs and contradictions of free housing? Right? And let's go back to these three visuals. Right? Now, the first map, the very idea of free housing. I am very keen on recuperating the slum debates, quote unquote, the slum debates of the 1960s and 1970s. There's a rich scholarship on slums from the late colonial period, including and early post-colonial period, including Nikhil Rao. Wonderful scholarship post-1991, right? That Cold War, Third World political project period, it's a black box, right? And I was talking yesterday. I'm very happy to talk about the planning archives and the planning archives on slums that have just gone missing from this period, right? But I want to take us back to the quote unquote slums of the 1960s and 70s, because it reminds us that the key social policy of the developmental state was full employment, right? It was in the 1970s that the welfare obligation of the state got recoded from full employment to free housing. And the emergence of the Shiv Sena as a political party is very much a part of this story, right? In India today, there are very, very important struggles around the right to housing, right? The free housing policy can be seen as a right to housing. There are struggles around right to food. Why is it that resistance movements are not agitating for the right to work? Right? So the prior third world history of slums is crucial because it reminds us that slums are sites of the productive economy. They are sites of working class struggles. So what does the shift from full employment to free housing reveal? And what is the welfare obligation of free housing allied or bracket out? Right? Second, the free housing policy, this was the empirical puzzle, right? The free housing policy did not initially take off. It took the planning of mega infrastructure projects to create a market for the air rights market. So in other words, air rights are not about quote unquote thin air, right? They are about mega infrastructure projects, rent thick, grounded, lumpy mega infrastructure projects, and the mega displacement associated with them. Now, as Rahul mentioned, in my first book, I looked at one of these mega infrastructure projects, right? This economic corridor. And of course, the puzzle for that book was these two cities, Bombay and Pune, were already connected by a highway. They had railway lines, and yet a new economic corridor was being planned, right? So it raised this question, why are planners planning a seemingly redundant economic corridor? And you can ask the same question here, right? Why these tolled, very high toll coastal roads, sea links, tunnels that hardly anyone is using? But that's a wrong question to ask, right? Because it is these mega infrastructure projects that make possible this new frontier of privatization, including the privatization of air, right? So there's a whole new political economy of rent that's now being rewritten in the Mumbai region. And finally, this contradiction of location, right? That the planning of the air rights market perversely restructures the very nature of the local state, where the state can now fulfill its social obligation of free housing only by deploying its zoning powers to keep land prices as high as possible. So to end, there are costs to free housing, right? There is no free housing. In this new social contract between slums and monetized air, developers, including Adani, not only gain access to, but they can also unlock the value of air through providing free housing to slum dwellers. In other words, developers can enclose and privatize air as part of the welfare obligation of social housing. Right? It is also through the free housing policy that Adani actually gains almost 80% of public land. 80% of the land in Dharavi is actually public land, right? Owned by the municipality, the state government, and the central government, the Indian Railways, right? But it is through these very, very convoluted planning processes that bring together welfare, infrastructure, and air rights that a new frontier of privatization is being planned. And this new social contract, which is premised on the privatization of public resources, including air, relies on mundane technical instruments that all of us use in our planning offices, including FSI and TDR. So I'll end here. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Sai. Well, that's a lot. And you've really given us a lot of stuff to think about. I'm not going to ask you a question, but I'm going to use the privilege of moderating this to just share some of my own comments, which might help you in the way you think about this, but also might trigger other questions off. I love the way you rattled out all that infrastructure that's being built. And I was suddenly remembering Arjun Appudurai, who beautifully called it the weapons of mass construction in what they were doing to the city. And, I want to kind of talk about three things just as comments. One is what is happening in the metro, right? The second is just the TDR, just to add a few observations, which I'm sure you know about, but it might contextualize things. And the third is to zoom into Dharavi particularly, because we were very fortunate when we took a group of students last year that I think we probably were privileged to the first presentation they made to us on site of their plans. It was very early in the process, about a year ago. And at that point, they shared more than they should have shared. So I'll share some of that they shouldn't have shared. I'm just curious because I therefore made it a point to talk about your architecture, urban design credentials, and your interest in space, right? And so, I think it's worth thinking about, you're looking at Dharavi, or at least in this talk, and what happened in the north. And of course, because of industries, slums, as in the post-industrial scenario, began to livelihoods, the relation between living and dwelling and livelihoods and all of that. But also, I think it'd be interesting to speculate about the bigger implications of whether it's Dharavi or some of these weapons of mass construction and what they're doing vis-a-vis the metropolitan imagination, because it's completely altering it. Yeah. So as you said in passing, the tunnels and the freeways, who's using this? Actually, everyone who's driving TDR and the values of lands all the way up to the northern suburbs that's the reason why that even exists. I mean, when I talk to friends, because I'm so disturbed about the kind of investment that was made, and one knows the reasons for all of this, the only metric that most people in Mumbai, that at least one talks to, or any of us would come is that, okay, now I can get to the airport in 10 minutes, or I can get into South Bombay in 15 minutes. It's all this metric, the convenience, which means mobility is becoming so elastic for the rich through this investment in infrastructure that is driving the real estate prices through the roof, right? And it's actually altering the metropolitan imagination of how people now with the Setu, how they can live in New Bombay. It's all bringing new meaning. The fact they've put an international airport in New Bombay is going to unscramble everything. So it would be very useful. I mean, if you can comment on this, or just take it away as things that you might think about, is it would reveal other patterns, which could be quite interesting. And I think your observation is correct. And I think the key thing which you didn't mention, which I'm sure you've written about, is under the earlier legislative framework, the only condition contingent on TDR was that it had to go north from where it emanated. And because it went north, meant the values just dropped because you got away from the center. And so the only way to leverage locational value was to come up with the slum redevelopment, because then the developer can actually to build in there, right? So I think that's an important spatial consideration. I mean, you posed it as location, but I think your story makes that even more vivid in terms of that leveraging. Yeah, and in fact, just for whatever it's worth, for everyone here, the eastern waterfront, which is the port lands in Mumbai, which is 1,600 acres or 400 acres of land. One of the proposals Shirish Patel and a few of us had made was interesting in that it really unsettled the regime, because what we said was detach right to build from FSI. And what you do is you have an FSI which is as low as 1.33, which is the FSI you get when you own the land, but your right to build would be 10 FSI, which means then in a concentrated area where you could put new infrastructure, you could mop up all the TDR without destroying slums, without destroying communities, etc. Right? Now, of course, that was not politically because, I mean, that eastern waterfront Portland is also leveraged. The central government owns it. So it's actually a black hole. It's 1,600 acres, which is a black hole in the development plan of Mumbai. Can you imagine the real estate on it, which is decided by the center in Delhi? So here the center begins to have a stake, which might be also an interesting dimension for you to, contemplate and what that might mean. And then coming to the Adani project in particular, I think it would be interesting to think about some of the other political leverage which gives it value, right? So you think about it, you were looking north. If you just look east, look west, what is across the creek is the Bandra Kurla complex, which is now becoming the commercial center with the highest land values.
It's an extension of BKC.
It's an intention of BKC, correct? With Geo and the Ambanis all really owning it, which means the adjacency, the value has shot up. So Dharavi, so Ambani is on one side and Adani is on the other side with the creek separating. Now, that is a value that so it's also a hidden value if you begin to look at the context more broadly, and which is worth, I think, considering versus only the north, right? And I think what is interesting, and which is what we learned, and I see some of the students who were in that Dharavi meeting, what we learned was that the government made a huge exception. So essentially, when you have a slum and it has to be redeveloped, 50% of the land becomes for the developer to develop for profit, and the other 50% is to house, I mean, roughly, to house the slum dwellers. But in order to get that 50% to do either, 50% of those houses have to be moved somewhere else. So they go usually into a transit. Sometimes they're stuck in a transit camp for 10 years if the value falls, right? And it's dislocating of livelihoods and all of that. The big dispensation they got was the adjoining railway land was given to them free. Now, how do you put a value to that? Because that is a completely special case, which means what we might distill out of the Dharavi case might not be necessarily, I mean, it has to be qualified because it might not necessarily tell us the story of what might be potential policies or imaginaries for other such developments. So I think these are just three observations that I thought would be interesting for you to think about or to respond to, and then we should just open it for questions.
Yes, no, thank you. Thanks, Rahul. Yes, the BKC is, because Dharavi, of course, is seen as an extension to the BKC. The metropolitan imagination is a really, really important point. I have some thoughts, maybe, but let me,
No,
and then we can
so these
also.
are not questions. These were
This
just
is-
comments and things. So I'm going to open
Thank
it
you
out
so
for
much.
questions. Please introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, I'm Pratima. I'm just graduated from my PhD. But thank you, sir, for this talk. I feel like every time I listen to you, I come away feeling bigger. I just have a clarification. When you mentioned that it's an unwilling resettlement of the slum dwellers, like, do they have any political constituency kind of force to like, or is yeah.
So, that's a really, really good question. And, one of the provocations that I had in trying to recuperate the third world political project of ancillarization, right? And the social policy of full employment is, there's something very interesting. So, again, based on some of the ethnic business archives, and Ria was part of this research. It was very clear that the big factories at the time, and they were Gujarati, right? The ethnic rivalry between the Gujaratis and the Maharashtrians and the Marathas, right? But they tied up with the Shiv Sena, which is a Maratha party, right? And I think it's really important because capitalism, you've got these ethnic rivalries, and there is a way in which alliances have to be made across ethnic divisions. But they tied up with the Shiv Sena, and the Shiv Sena was at the forefront of ancillarization, right? So when when you talk to these people who are late operators, they say we're self-employed. Yes, you're self-employed, but there's no obligation either on the part of the state or the big factory to provide you with any legal benefits. If there's an accident, you go back to your village in eastern UP, right? So the Shiv Sena was very much a part of that project of ancillarization, which also undid organized trade unionizing in the city, right? So to me, what is particularly interesting about the Shiv Sena is it's the emergence of the Shiv Sena during this period of ancillarization consolidates a politically organized constituency, but an economically unorganized constituency, right? And this is really something that I want to unpack more with this social policy shift of full employment to free housing, right? Like, where is the right to work in free housing? Right?
But if I may just add to that, if you talk to Sheila Patel, for example, because when I took the students and we were so shocked after this presentation that I reached out to her, and she said, well, they're going to be complicated resistances because she said, according to her, this is a number I remember, I might be a few off. She said there are about 28 national political parties that are beginning to operate in Dharavi, because the ethnicities are so diverse from Tamil Nadu to elsewhere. And so they are beginning, as this project was announced, then of course the stakes are so high that now it's just beginning to emerge as an organized. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Akshati. I'm doing a dual degree between Sloan and Dust, so excited to be here and enjoying this talk. A quick question for you is something that I'm actually also from Bombay, is an important part of this discussion, is that what's interesting to me in this question in particular also is that Adani's primary business is not construction. Like, he doesn't have a background in history in kind of designing, building, etc. It's very new part of his portfolio. And so especially someone with that architectural background, how do you see that influencing like the kind of housing that's going to come up both as the for-profit part of the housing and also what you see as public housing? Because even the builders who are building public housing are doing a pretty terrible job. I've seen some of them. They're, the light is horrible. There's no accessibility. Like, how do you see someone who doesn't have a building background influencing the kind of architecture that comes up in that area?
You're asking her, right? Yes.
Anyone with the expertise, but of course.
I'm happy to actually add to this as well.
I would point you to one of our friends, Lorena Searle's work, right? And it's she's doing much more recent research now, but she's got this wonderful puzzle in the landscapes of accumulation, where she looks at, well, firstly, let me start with, there were a few investors that I was talking to in 2017, 2018, and this was after Trump had visited India, right? And they said that Trump had like thrown his hands up in the air, and he said, no one can do real estate in India. India doesn't have conclusive titles, right? Conclusive titles are considered sine qua non. It's like a contract, right? It's considered sine qua non for any real estate development in the West, right? India lacks conclusive titles, right? But that does not mean that capitalist land markets don't work, and it does not mean that real estate deals aren't structured, right? The way in which it's done is very different. So it's not a surprise, for instance, that Trump only lends his brand name, but it's local actors who actually assemble the land. So land assembly is extremely fraught in India, and that's where the value of the real estate deal resides, right? So going from this, Lorena's puzzle is, why is it, if you have joint ventures between, say, a New York firm and a local developer in Delhi or in the NCR or in Bombay, the value is not commensurate across these firms. Why? Because in New York, the interiors are really important, right? In India, land assembly is a mess, right? In the absence of conclusive land titles, you could have someone from like 150 years back saying, my chachas, nanas, dadas, someone has a claim to this land, right? So the value actually resides in land assembly. So then in that case, it's not a surprise, like Rahul said, industrial capitalists have made a foray into real estate, right? Adani has made a foray into real estate. And to me, it's really about capturing, it's a rentier acquisition, right? It's land, it's a rent-thick sector, it's land, right?
And for that reason, one of the things we learned that we were surprised about was that they had made an argument that people who lived on the ground floor were the original settlers who had expanded their house on the first floor to get rent. And so they were not counting and giving the rights to the people on the upper floors of these houses, because those were families that were renting who weren't counted as part of this calculation, again, because the land was so valuable. And just a very brief response to you, but the question I pose counter to you is, if you went back 15 or 20 years, Adani wasn't in shipping, Adani wasn't in airports, Adani wasn't in anything. He's in that now. And how does he solve the architecture problem? He hires a big Boston firm who now presents. So, that's all solvable, I suppose, in their imagination. Sorry, Diane here. And we go.
Hi, I'm Diane Davis. I'm in the Urban Planning and Design Program across the street at the GSD. And we miss you, Sai. You were with us for so long and you're doing great things at Berkeley. And this was an amazing talk. I loved it. I'd love to see the text and ancillary a lot of concepts that I'm not familiar with. I guess I wanted to kind of pick up on your question. Well, first of all, let me say I love that graphic about the fact that you have these rights possible, but it's not really taking advantage of it. So that's a very powerful argument. And I want to ask you a little bit more about that, if you can help me understand. Because it seems to me that there are two possible explanations that probably related. One has to do with the nature of work, which I think is central to your argument, which is, and you end by saying it's not free housing because who's asking about the right to work? So ultimately, it's a trade-off. You get a house, but you don't get that location and you don't get that production process in Dharavi. So you're really undermining what made it possible to survive in Mumbai, whether you called it formal sector as a worker, right? So the question becomes whether that in that period where it didn't move forward, is it because there was still enough power and organization within the informal sector or the settlements, and I know Liza knows all about this too, pushing back whether independently, autonomous through parties. So whether it was that there was some implicit ways in which that there was enough concern about work that it didn't move to just the air rights directly. So that's one explanation. A second one, which I think might be related, is that maybe this is just how capitalism is working in cities of global south now. And nobody cares about work anymore. And that's why it's on Donnie.
Exactly.
He got his labor, he got what he wanted out of the bodies, and now he's getting what he wants out of the air. And everybody is signing into that. So my question, and that's another more macro explanation, but it's only possible if there's no opposition. So my question, two-part, is like, what's the nature of struggle over work and employment? I know you're interested in it because you kept on referring to it in Mumbai, and where is it anywhere? I work on Mexico City. Where is it? Or are we in a world where it's just real estate speculation drives every city, and that's what this story is with more detail.
That is the big question, right? I know Eve is interested. We've had long conversations on the quote unquote post-industrial city, right? And there is a big urban question here, right? Because during the Cold War, the Third World Political Project in Mexico, in India, manufacturing was co-eval with urbanization. Industrialization was co-eval with with urbanization. And to me, the 1970s is this really crucial where there is some restructuring, and now everyone is a real estate hustler. Right? That's the way you survive. You can negotiate on where your house will be, whether it'll be 350 square feet, whether it'll be 225 square feet. But you're not talking about the nature of work, right? So I think that really is the big question. Here, of course, there are people, including Danny Roderick, who talk about premature deindustrialization in cities of the global south. And in some ways, maybe we have to go back to very old-fashioned industrial policy. And on that note, let me just add this. One of the things that I'm really interested in from this 1960s, 1970s period is that the town planners of this period, and these are people who are very inspired by the UK, by Fabian socialism, the town planners are working in the service of the 5-year plan and of development planners, right? So part of this book is and there's nothing about the professionalization of planning during this period, which was not for the market, right? It was about disciplining the market. And so I really want to recuperate this erased story about the neglected actor of the town planner who's acting in the service of the development plan. And they're actually, was this ideal? Of course not. There were all kinds of caste inequalities, riven through with ethnic conflict, right? Ugly ethnic conflict. But still, that you're thinking about what does a right to dignified work look like, right? So I don't have an answer because that's a very—
Sorry, there was a question back there. Yeah, just introduce yourself.
Sneha, I am a lawyer and a PhD student in anthropology at Brandeis. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. My question to you was, when you're talking about resistances by people and like by urban development agendas particularly, I was curious about your opinion on the role of the 74th Constitutional Amendment and basically like just urban local bodies and just the inherent weaknesses of people's representation in city development priorities. Basically, like, I mean, I look at feminist urban planning, but like just the fact that so many Indians, whether they're living in slums or not, don't have a say in their local politics. And so just how does that play out in creating a situation where this is becoming possible? And second, the role of constitutional courts in acting as a check to this kind of rampant development, or like, I mean, a lot of blatant illegality, or like a lot of international agencies playing a role in this. Yeah, just broadly, what is the role of democratic law in the city?
It's such a good question. If there are PhD students, I've actually been trying to get some of my PhD students to do a dissertation on this, and they don't. So if anyone is, it's a big question, right? Why are urban local governments in India so weak? What do we call them? You don't call them urban local governments, urban local bodies, right? Which comes out of that period of limited franchise, right? Of late colonialism. And we remain with that. But on the other hand, and this is what I was really interested in the first book, rural local bodies and Panchayati Raj institutions, very powerful, right? The kind of democratic power and democratic voice and democratic decision making with the PRIs and the Panchayati Raj institutions is immense, right? So clearly there is a political economy of the urban-rural divide. And of course, people have written about this. The agrarian countryside, for many historical reasons, was extremely organized, right? That's where the sugar constituency was. And so it was the agrarian countryside that controlled the state government. But this is the point. So one, I think there is a dissertation to be written on why urban rural governments in India are so weak, right? Even the 73rd constitutional amendment took off, right? There are Gram Sabhas, which are incredible deliberative democratic institutions. Ward committees, 74th amendment did not take off, right? So there's a big question there. But I think, Jerry Frug, unfortunately, passed away. And I learned a lot from Jerry Frug, who has written about local government law, right? The power, including the power to approve the development plan, rests with the state government. It's not the Mumbai municipality, right? And to me, what was really striking during my visit, particularly this summer, was there is really a restructuring of planning institutions, and decisions are being made, and all of this is recorded. Huh?
Do you want to stop?
I've said enough things anyway.
Decisions are being made CM directly to the PMO, right? So I think there is a centralization. So a further, instead of decentralization, and this question that you're rightly asking about what does democratic, there is a re-centralization of power, which is also what Rahul was talking about, right? With the central government now becoming a very powerful planning actor in municipal real estate and zoning politics, right? So all of this to say, there is a really important question here on the political economy of local governments and urban local governments in India. And I would point you to, if you want to look at historical reasons for this, I would point you to Nikhil Rao's work. He's a historian at Wellesley.
Rahul.
Yeah. So Rahul Gupta, research associate at the Mittal Institute. So in an earlier conversation with you, Rahul, you said Dharavi is a buzzing industrial hub. It's an economy by itself. So is there, with the Adani developing Dharavi, are we losing industrial enterprise by kind of moving these lathe workers into these residential apartments? Is part of the economy getting disturbed?
Yeah, it's it's interesting because it depends on what work are these late operators doing, right? So there is, of course, a lot of scholarship on Dharavi being a buzzing economy of small scale workshops. But this moment of ancillarization is really important for me because these are not self-reliant workshops, right? What was happening in the 1960s and 1970s is big factories were subcontracting. So this in some ways is the antecedent to what is now the economic orthodoxy of supply chain. That was what was happening in the 1960s and 70s, and Shiv Sena is a part of this story, right? So this question of the lathe operators now, they're not it's not a productive economy. It's not a productive economy in the sense of that developmental project of the 1960s and 70s. Right? I really don't know what Make in India means. Right? And you just have to look to China. And in fact, a lot of the people that I spoke to said there were a lot of protections for small scale enterprises up till the 90s, right? Including the reserved items reservation, which means certain items can only be manufactured by small scale enterprises. That has been completely restructured. And now a lot of the products that the small scale enterprises used to manufacture, it's China that's flooding the market, right? So China has an industrial policy. We don't have an industrial policy in India.
Thank you.
Mish?
Sai, this was a wonderful presentation. I had two questions, Sai, because it's in hearing your story, I'm trying to see the link between the macroeconomy and the urban economy. And you give some comments, but it would be nice to see some data on the macroeconomy and how the economic composition of Mumbai's industrial sector is changing. And who is being employed, what is, without that, it's very hard to make that judgment. The second thing I was going to say that in terms of your comment about employment versus housing, I mean, in the past, there was very little formal employment. That's why we had the slums. So right now, with India picking up a growth rate of 7-8%, it's a different ballgame. So I'm struck by the story between employment and housing, because in the US case, in cities, when cities try to do something, they really don't have the power to do employment, but they do have power over housing. And so they do little bit of employment, then doesn't work, economic development, then they go do some housing. Then when housing doesn't appear because there's a strong market, then they say, let's do some economic development. So there's always a tussle between what the local government can do. Local governments don't have much control over employment, unfortunately, right? So what do you want them to do? And in your, I would say one other thing. One is in your story, where this redevelopment is happening, people are getting free housing. When we did, Vinit and I was struck by how much people wanted this redevelopment. Yeah. The people who lived there. And Sheila was asking for a payment. The developer came and said, you don't have to pay anything, I'll give you free. And of course, poor people like the free. You and I would like the free. So it seems to me by giving them the 250 square feet or whatever, redevelopment, it's not that bad for me. I think they're better off that way than they were before. So why I see in your assessment a kind of a broad side assessment that things are going bad in this new market economy. What I want to say is maybe the picture is more gray. And I think, so that's one. The second question coming from technology, MIT, of course, I'm very struck by these high rises and the construction of it. Who are the contractors who are doing it? Because as you saw in Turkey, etc., this building collapsed.
Yes.
So can you share it with us, technologically, are these designs good enough or they're going to collapse?
The designs for Dharavi, you asked.
We have a 64.
From what I've seen, they're good enough. But,
Good enough, yes.
Yeah, but it's a valid question about without the technology, you cannot do it. You cannot go up so high.
So it's in another way to metaphorically put it, it's going to be a little Singapore and
But we have
that
a lot,
kind of paradigm.
but we have a lot of civil engineers who can put up a
Yeah, yeah.
big wish.
The building, but you need construction, you need being, I mean, the whole
It is.
infrastructure has to be put in this high, very high.
I mean, I think what has been proved even in Mukul's vertical city is the technologies that support a high-rise paradigm. Elevators, they don't work. No one can fix them. Older people get stuck on the 12th floor for months and months and things, sometimes years. So there are problems like that. But I think my sense is, and I won't take up your time, is this is going to result in a form of gentrification. It's being designed like that. So it becomes an asset for the poor who, yeah, and so your point is valid. They cash in on it and move on. Yeah.
And the city is.
Trade union
Yeah.
organizing the working, which I learned from your class.
I know, but
But the organizing of the working class, right? Like really the people that I spoke to, they are negotiating, should it be 225 square feet? Should it be 350? Like I said, and I didn't say this lightly, everyone is forced to become within these structural constraints, forced to become a real estate hustler. Right? And I think there is something remarkable also about these operators. Right? There's something that I learned from your class and Meenu Tiwari's work, the technical expertise, right, which comes from doing this kind of work, subcontracted work for like a major multinational corporation. Yes, your lathe may be in a quote unquote slum, but it's apprenticeship, like that guild, right? It's the building of technical expertise. Where is that happening again? If you want any kind of make in India.
no, but the nature of the job market, nature of employment is changing. The industrial structure of the country is changing.
Yes.
The industrial structure of the city is changing. So the lathe making is that what was going on before. You cannot stick to that as a mode anymore. But let me ask one other thing, Sai, that was
But
going
just
about
very
your.
quickly, but if you have to seriously take, I mean, China did it, right? It's actually remarkable looking at China. And I think it's such a cop-out argument saying it's an authoritarian state, even an authoritarian state legitimacy, but the kind of like primary education, right? Vocational training, the manufacturing that China achieved, what has Made in India done? Right, which is the flagship policy of the BJP government.
I don't know enough about that, but to respond, but just want to say about the local government. I want to say about the local government, because the revenue that the local government is going to make
Yes,
from the selling the rights,
exactly.
it would be nice to see what that revenue is spent for. That is more, because they are making revenue. Before they didn't have the revenue.
You know what they built, making it, so there was this old coastal road again that Wilbur Smith proposed in 1962. A lot of this FSI has financed that coastal road.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, you had a question, sir.
I was wondering.
Can you introduce yourself,
Oh,
please?
yes, I'm Abel. I am a freshman at the college. And I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about whether you think the structure of selling the air rights in order to finance the free housing is inherently flawed at that kind of low level, or if it's the larger structures around how it's being implemented that are causing the problems you're discussing.
Well, you know, one way of thinking about this is I have a paper that I co-wrote with a friend of mine. We did our PhD together, Matthias Van Massacres. And he looked at something called, his entire dissertation and book was on ecosystem service markets, right? Carbon trading, right? And I think it's helpful to think about air rights alongside carbon trading and ecosystem service markets, right? And again, to me, this almost like spatial hubris, right? That location does not matter. That's the premise of carbon trading as well, right? That these pollution credits can just be transferred across space. And that same kind of premise operates for the TDR market, right? Which means in some ways, air rights is not actually embedded in the political ecology of that place, right? Which has dire ecological consequences, what economists call externalities, right? So there are consequences to this.
Okay, we have time for one. Oh, okay. We'll accumulate this because we're running out of time. So we'll just accumulate. Go ahead.
Hi, so thank you so much. My name is Megha and I'm studying a master in real estate at the design school. We have a course on sustainability and I had a question on like with what Adani is doing and like the government together. Are there like it feels like there's only going to be extra pollution and like higher real estate values from doing this. So are there like government policies that are going to come in place to reduce, like mitigate?
Reduce, absolutely.
No. But like it to be more sustainable and not make pollution worse.
Ananta.
I mean, in some ways, what is really important for me is, you know, when you think about the relationship between Adani and Modi, it often gets carried. To me, is actually not saying too much. And this could become a window into the political economy of the changing state capital. Right? So not a hopeful story. No, I'm sorry. I don't think there's good sustainability policies coming.
Keep it short, you're
yeah,
very
yeah.
running out of time. A lot of people
My
want-
name is Anandita and I'm a second year urban design student at the GSD. I think, thank you for the lovely presentation. It sort of boils down to the question of equality of rights to the city, essentially, and how you sort of distribute that as the government. And what you're talking about in this changed notion of the way in which the welfare state is operating, trading in real estate, if you've thought about what justice and equality might look like, because this sort of seems to be masking that in a way by saying that by legitimizing your housing and giving you a more pakka house or a formal housing, you're sort of giving them land titling and other things in the city. And so if you think there are other ways to do this beyond this.
Can I take a couple of
Yeah,
minutes?
please.
You had a quick question, yeah.
Hi,
Keep it
thank you
short,
for your
please.
great talk. My name's Taylor Lowe. I'm an anthropologist and architect. I'm an affiliate with the Berkeley Klein Center and Meta Lab. My question stems from the core what you had said about how after the World Bank, the depoliticization of infrastructure sort of afforded the arbitrage of TDR. And the question I had, especially when thinking about like what you described as the gleaming infrastructural projects that make all of the monetization of air possible and attractive, is there an affordance there for resistant politics in the way that I see like Julie Chu, an anthropologist, Chicago wrote an article, When Infrastructure Fails, showing how the failure of depoliticizing infrastructure, even in a place like China, affords resistant politics. My own research is on design activism in Thailand during a military dictatorship and an absolutist monarch, and how failures in buildings and architecture allowed the only protests in the country. And so in this case, despite the seeming gleaming ballast versus what's happening here, is that sort of sowing an affordance for the repoliticization in the Rancière kind of way, the depolicing of the very depoliticization that happened in infrastructure that made it possible.
Yeah, you can take, no, just respond to these two, it'll be too much otherwise.
You know, we can also take questions and I'm happy to answer offline
Okay,
because there are
fine.
lots of.
Okay, you had a point, but yeah.
Thank you so much.
Keep it brief, please, we're really running out of time.
Okay,
yeah?
will do. I'm Adarsh, I'm a Mumbaiker. My question is,
You're wearing a Mumbai Cricket Association.
yes, there you go, yeah. I wish I could say I planned this.
Today.
Yeah. No, really appreciate all the insights. You know, we spoke about this sort of tension between sort of creating jobs, whose responsibility it is versus the responsibility. And we spoke about infrastructure, the mega projects and so on. But at the end of the day, like Indian cities and India as a whole is struggling with infrastructure, and that's sort of an enabler for jobs and economic. I'm just curious about sort of what key recommendation or two or the path forward, any like examples we can look towards both within India or outside of India in terms of balancing doing infrastructure, doing it efficiently, but also mitigating its costs when it comes to rehabilitation. And also I understand sort of the importance of rehabilitation, but at the end of the day, like the jobs that are created with the infrastructure projects might not go to the ones who are getting rehabilitated or who are getting displaced. But sort of like, how do you think
That's
about
right.
those two costs?
And if I could just very quickly, because I in a very interesting way, you know, many of the trade union leaders in the 1960s and 70s that I spoke to, Comrade Vasily, so much time, right? And they are now organizing construction workers, who are the construction workers for the metro. So I think you're absolutely right, right? So it's not that working class organizing is not happening, but it's now the construction workers for the metros and for the infrastructure projects, which is a very interesting area of resistance to look at. Absolutely.
You're the last one here.
Samuel Maddox. I'm a first year PhD student in urban planning, a former student. And when I see and think about everything from air rights and restrictions on how tall one can build a building, as well as sort of the increased travel time between parts of the city, as well as ideas about shelter as a sort of initial first step. I can't separate this from ideas of health, public health, spatial dimensions of health. And I'm curious, especially with the World Bank being so involved, how health is being looked at or leveraged in a very positivistic sense or in other ways to sort of propel this project forward.
Who's responsible? Social justice. And
You know,
infrastructure
from
collapsing.
the question right to the city, I think this and the construction workers and the organizing of construction workers for metros and other infrastructure projects again takes us back to the question of work, right? And the right to work. So that's where my right to the city instinct would lie.
Collapsing
In terms of,
infrastructure.
yeah, yes, it is this classic STS framing, right? When infrastructure fails. I mean, but to me, again, it's this fundamental question of why are you pumping capital, right? All of this capital into making seemingly redundant infrastructure, right? And I think that's a question that needs to be asked because it helps you again understand the political economy. Like Rahul is saying, it's very wealthy people who are using the Atal Setu ceiling. It's not going, I don't think it's going to fail.
Yeah, and I just, in closing, I can't but help, think and flag out 3 questions that I had as interesting, perhaps further research explorations. I think one is just related to exactly, I think Bish asked the question and you've responded to Anandita there and to the question of jobs. And I think that's why one would yet emphasize, I think the solution to Dharavi doesn't lie in Dharavi, which is what is happening, but the solutions to the questions of Dharavi lie in the metropolitan area. And it's very interesting that IIT Bombay has been appointed now to study and reimagine the whole Thana Belapur industrial corridor, because industry is gone, but it's fantastic land, strategically placed within the geography of the metropolitan region. And so therefore, I mean, the implications of many of these observations and how one situates it in the metropolitan imagination, I think becomes critical even from looking at the economics, the meta-economics and all of that. The second thought that occurred in terms of a research project is you pose this provocation or question that it's an absent archive, right? And what were the town planners? So the question I would pose is, were there town planners? Because the decisions were made in municipal departments of sanitation, water supply, electricity, roads, etc. Yes, there were a handful of town planners. The MMRDA, which is the Mumbai Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, was set up to create this metropolitan imagination with town planners. But as a discipline, if you think about it in that sense, it was very thin. And therefore, that archive in the formal way we would imagine, I mean, the slum archive is a separate story, but
MMRT and Sitco, there are no archives.
no archives, no, absolutely. Because they don't have the culture of not only archiving, but actually town planning or city planning is absent there. It's the hegemony of the engineers who are making those decisions. Be worth exploring. I'm just putting these as potential areas that need, much more deeper investigation because it will tell us the story of how the decisions were made. And the last point, in closing, that graph that you had of the spike is really interesting. And actually, that's got immense potential to be unpacked in interesting ways, because you could argue that there was accumulated demand because so many people in India's liberalization, where real estate became the laundry machine for the black economy, that so much money was parked in real estate that you could not leverage its value till the infrastructure came there. And that's where the amazing nexus between the politicians and the developers occurred. And this infrastructure was pushed through overnight, literally overnight. And appropriated, and now it's serving the ones who are driving the TDR market, etc. So I mean, I think to what came first there and how it played out and what are the Trojan that were used is a very interesting question for research, because it would reveal a lot in the making of the city and how decisions are made. And in a sense, it's linked to the question of the archive, because again, it wasn't town planners making those decisions. There were other forms of infrastructural decisions that were linked to investments in land. I was lucky in the very early 90s to be involved with Shirish Patel doing a development plan for Vasai and Virar, which didn't have a development plan, and Sidco was appointed as the authority. It was such an interesting experience because every time we submitted a draft, there were 100 requests, all from politicians, about what is in the wrong place, why is, and you suddenly started realizing who owned the land, what uses they wanted to be on that land. And that's where we came up with this idea of detaching the right of building to the FSI. And it was explosive. We basically had to get off the job because it just wasn't politically viable at that point. So I think the archives is a very good question, and it'll start beginning to answer, let me say, the broader culture of planning in the city, which will give you other answers. So thank you very much, Sai. Thank you all.